Welcome to this Tutor to You sociology topic video on culture and identity, focusing on changing definitions of culture. How do we define culture? The most basic definition of culture is that it is a way of life of a group of people or individuals. While in previous videos we've discussed different types of cultures that belong to these broad social groups, in this video we're going to focus on how definitions of these cultures change over time. But before we do, we need to look at what constitutes culture. The culture of a group is usually made up of aspects of their everyday lives. The normal patterns of behaviour, for example getting up in the morning and going to work or school, sleeping in the evening, having meals at certain times of the day. Another aspect of culture is the values that are present in our society. For example, working hard will equal success, being educated is desirable, and that we need to be kind to others. Additionally, culture is reflected in the artefacts, signs and symbols we see around us. For example, it's commonly accepted in contemporary society that people will use smartphones to stay connected, pay for goods and access services, and these can be seen as a contemporary example of an artefact. Finally, there are assumptions that are made within our culture. And as with other aspects of culture, such as dress, language, and how we interact with one another, these are constantly changing, which makes it more difficult to define culture as a homogeneous entity. But was this always the case? Looking back at pre-industrial society, culture was more fragmented across geographical areas. Local cultures, what we may refer to as folk cultures, were the dominant form of culture in society at this period. Culture was constructed of particularistic norms and values, those specific to regional groups. For example, in the UK, there are many regional dialects, cuisines, traditions, holidays and forms of music and oral history that stem back to pre-industrial society. This can extend into early industrial society, particularly with regionalised patterns of employment, for example mining in Yorkshire, the North East and Scotland, or the shipping industries in Liverpool and Glasgow. In pre- and early industrial society, these were less likely to be influenced by national customs and trends, and were almost self-contained. In many areas of the UK, individuals will still see themselves as being defined by the identities that these cultures represented. Scots, Irish, Welsh, Geordies, Scousers, and within London, various identities that are constructed based upon communities in different areas of London. However, the Industrial Revolution saw the first movements towards a mass culture as individuals moved to towns and cities for employment, and this created a melting pot of cultures and a new mass culture started to emerge. Migration, particularly from Ireland, also impacted on the development of cultures, with areas such as Liverpool and Glasgow developing cultures heavily influenced by Irish migration. These mass cultures were formed from a hybrid of folk cultures, absorbing elements of language, music, entertainment and history to form a larger mass culture. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution and the growth of Protestantism meant that the population needed to become more educated, and both religious institutions and the creation of elementary education led to greater levels of literacy amongst the population. Whilst the elites had largely been educated before this and had access to literature, a new generation looked to obtain more cultural knowledge through reading. However, before the advent of modern printing technologies, books were expensive and often only afforded by the elites. As the Industrial Revolution brought about innovation, namely through the printing press, access to reading materials increased. However, this also saw the creation of high and low culture. Books were still the preserve of the wealthy, whilst the working classes would read serialised stories. Some, such as Dickens, would go on to become part of the literary canon, but others, often referred to as penny dreadfuls, would become part of what may be defined as low culture. Mass-produced stories to entertain rather than inform. This distinguished between social classes and can still be seen to this day in literature, films and other creative arts. It can be argued, however, that education takes elements of high culture and transmits these to young people, ensuring that the dominant nature of high culture in society continues. This can be evidenced through the national curriculum, and Ofsted's recent focus on ensuring the teaching of cultural knowledge. Further technological advancements such as radio, television, and more recently the digital revolution have seen increased access to a mass culture that is easily transmitted to the population. As technology advances, this mass culture is accessible to all and influences other aspects of culture, our language, our clothing, our tastes. This also incorporates elements of global culture as society moves into the late 20th and early 21st century, with global influences on sport, fashion, music, and film prominent in contemporary society. While mass culture is argued to be derivative and of lesser value still than high culture, the process of globalization has led to people increasingly being able to access elements of high culture, particularly through the internet. However, the extent to which this forms part of mass culture is still a matter of debate, and it's often down to individual choice rather than a collective engagement with global culture. One feature, particularly of late and postmodern society, is the rejection of mass culture. While in modern societies the majority conform to the norms, values and ideas of mass culture, as society progressed there has been more resistance. The increased development of subcultures, either reactive or independent to mass culture in the latter part of the 20th century and early 21st century, indicates a movement away from collective ideas such as the existence of a value consensus. While some in society still subscribe to mass culture, individuals are increasingly choosing to live by their own norms and values. Although critics have suggested that often these subcultural norms and values become part of mass culture over time. For example, rave culture, which generated a moral panic in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was soon integrated into mass culture, particularly amongst younger generations. There are, of course, different theoretical positions on the extent to which culture has changed. Conflict theorists such as Marxists and feminists argue that cultural norms and values still largely reflect those of the dominant groups in society. Conversely, interactionist approaches examine the social construction of society and advocate that individuals will inevitably interpret cultural signs and symbols based upon their accumulated knowledge of the culture they live in. This is shaped by an individual rather than being enforced, and so is more fluid over time. Finally, postmodernism argues that the broad range of individual experiences and the cultural diversity present in contemporary society is part of a movement away from meta-narratives towards individual stories, and this renders concepts such as mass culture irrelevant. Individuals have choice and will adopt individualized ways of living. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on culture and identity, looking at changing definitions of culture. Thanks for watching.